This is such an honor to be here, and that was just beautiful. Sandra and I go way back, and it's just an honor to be here and to have her sing. And Caleb, where is he at? The last time I remember you were a little boy hugging to my leg when I was leaving the airport. Oh, look at that. Thank you. Well, I bring greetings from you from the beautiful state of Portland, Oregon, all the way, and that's where I'm actually born and raised, there in Portland. And it's just such an honor to be here. I've just always had such a fascination with the beautiful country of Australia. Now, I've been dying to say this, and so if I mess up, bear with me. I'm going to just try now and see if I can say this right. I've been practicing this so long. All right, here we go. Good day, mates. Oh, wow, I've wanted to do that for so long. Thank you. Well, it's an honor once again, like I said, to be here with you. It's unique because I have a very unique background as a pastor. I'm not your typical pastor, their background. And let me just tell you this, that I joined the United States Air Force at 17. I went to an Adventist high school, college, and I wanted to figure that if I joined the Air Force, I would be able to travel the world. Air Force, airplanes, so I was so excited. And so my world adventure started this way. I ended up stationed in Washington, D.C., and never left D.C. my entire military career. There went my world travels. But I had the unique privilege of being hand-selected to work for a special group of men and women known as the White House Honor Guards. And we are the men and women who work with the President of the United States. You have two different groups. You have the Secret Service, who actually guard the President of the United States, and then you have the Honor Guard, and we do all the ceremonial things. So when they have the fancy dinners and banquets and all that stuff. And so I worked for 3 presidents. I went in with President Ronald Reagan, and then I worked for President George Bush, and then I worked a little bit for President Bill Clinton. And then I shocked everyone, including myself. The Lord called me to leave that to become a pastor. And so I ended up going to Oakwood College in Huntsville, Alabama, where I studied ministry, and I've been pastoring that journey ever since. And I have to tell you this before we start. Now, the guys who guard the president, if you ever want to make them laugh, and those are what we call Secret Service agents, all you have to do is say 2 words. And I promise you, if you see any Secret Service agent, just say these 2 words. I don't care if the president is right next to him. They will stop and start laughing. And let me explain what those 2 words are. Terry Johnsson. Let me explain to you why. Now, I'm known at the White House to this very day for speaking, but it's not the kind of speaking that you're thinking about. Now, let me just break it down with you, that when you go into the Air Force, at least in the United States, you go in what we call basic training, and that's when they just train you to be a soldier, or an airman, in my case. And then from there, you go to what we call technical school, and that's what your specialty. So if you're going to be a mechanic, or you're going to be the ones to watch the airplanes, that's where you do that training at. Now, I was in training to be what we call a security police, and those would be the ones who would guard the base and the planes and all that. And they made an announcement at our base that they were 12 men short at the White House to be part of the President's Honor Guard. And so since security police, they already start our background checks, it's easy for them to start there first before they open it up to the entire Air Force. And what generally happens is that after they choose, we'll put it this way, they choose 50 of you, and then the 50 of you go to Washington, D.C., and you're in training for 18 weeks. And during those 18 weeks, they let you know that the whole mission is to get you to quit. Only 5 of you are going to make it. And they tell you that from the very beginning, that we want the rest of you to quit. We only want the best of the best here. And it's a whole nother story of how I got to that point. But I will just tell you this, I was part of the 50. And I was so excited because I made week number 1. I didn't get thrown out. I did good. I made it all the way to week 1. And then week 2 came, and I will never forget, the sergeant comes in the room, and there's 50 of us, like I said, and he looks around and says, you know, 45 of you are going to be going home. Now, if you're one of the lucky 5 to stay here, let me tell you this. If you ever meet the President of the United States, because you're going to be with him, you're going to be right next to him all the time, the rule is simply this: you're never allowed to speak to him unless he speaks to you first. They said, because there are going to be a lot of times you'll hold his briefcase, you'll have his notes, and the last thing he needs is someone talking his ear off. Now, do you all understand that? You can't speak to the President of the United States unless he speaks to you. We all nodded yes. I nodded yes. Then I thought for a moment, and I raised my hand. He said, Johnson, what don't you understand about that? I said, well, if the president speaks to us, then, well, can we then ask him a question? He said, ask the president a question? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I took that as a yes. And so, friends, the next couple of days, I went and got a little card, and I got a little tiny golf pencil, and I would slip it in my pocket, and when I would think of questions to ask the president, I would write them on the little card. And I would slip it back in. I would be in lunch line, and I would think of another question, and I would write it down. By the end of the week, I had 17 questions I was going to ask the president. I had only been there 1 week. And so I will never forget, we're at the barracks at the end of the day. The same sergeant walks in, and he says, there's going to be a fancy banquet, and we need someone to open up a door. Where's that Johnson at? He's always talking so much. And so I raised my hand. He says, well, Johnson, do you think you can handle that? You can open up a door? You're going to probably see a United States congressman or somebody, so you better be on your best behavior. And I said, sure, I would love this. And I couldn't believe it. I had just gotten here. I'm already going to see a congressperson or something. This is going to be so exciting. And so we go to the Hilton Hotel there in downtown Washington, D.C., and friends, I will just tell you this. It was the fanciest thing I had ever seen in my life. I mean, the ladies had evening gowns, stars and stripes. Everyone you can imagine in Washington, D.C. was in that room. Now, my job was very simple. They had a stage. They had a podium. There was a door to the side with a little black screen. And they told me that there's going to be a guy in the back, a Secret Service agent. When he nods at me, all I had to do is open up the door, let the congressperson come in. He's going to walk by me. He's going to go up and he's going to say his speech. And when he's done, you just simply open the door and let him go back out again. I'm thinking, fine. So I'm just there and I'm standing by the door. I'm so excited. I'm going to see a U.S. congressman. Only been here a week and a half. This is so exciting. All of a sudden, a Secret Service agent walks by me, goes on the stage, takes the microphone and simply says this: we need everyone to please evacuate the room at this time. Everyone, please leave. Band, sit your instruments down. Ladies, take your purses with you. Please leave the building at this time. So people started leaving and rushing out, and then they brought in bomb-sniffing dogs. So I started to leave too, and he says, no, Airman, you stay there by the door. I'm thinking, it's fine. If this place blows up, I'm going to be the only one left in this building. I'm horrified. I'm standing by the door, and dogs are sniffing for bombs. And I'm just shaking. And then they did the strangest thing in the world. They started setting up metal detectors like at the airport at all the entrances. I'm still standing by the door. Well, after an hour, they start letting people come back in again. The place fills up and they're telling them, just take your seats. Everyone, just please take your seats. Well, they finally give me the signal to open this door up, and I want to see a congressman. This is so good. I had only been there for a week and a half. This is great. Well, I open up the door, and instead of a congressman, President Ronald Reagan steps out. I shouldn't have been near the president. They hadn't even checked my background, anything. He had decided 1 hour before that he wanted to come and make an appearance there. And what made it so unique is that was the same place where he was shot at 4 years earlier. And that was his first time back. And so Reagan's standing there, and he has a few minutes before he goes on the stage, and he's just looking around. All of a sudden, Reagan looks down at my name tag, and he simply says, Airman Johnson, how are you doing today? My chance to talk to the President of the United States. 17 questions. And friends, it was so bad, the color guard, those are the guys who carry the flags behind the president. So they're facing Reagan's back, and they look and they're saying, that's Johnson, this is gonna be good. And they're laughing so hard, their flags are shaking. And I looked at the president, I simply said, President Reagan, how you start, I couldn't get my name out of my mouth. It got so bad that Reagan just started looking at my lips move. Then Reagan just starts laughing. You're such a joker. So Reagan goes on the stage and he's making this fiery speech. I'm not afraid. I've come right back where they shot me at. And I will never forget this. His hand is in the air as he's making this powerful point. And as his hand was in the air, he stops. He glances over at his hand and he looks at me. And then Reagan starts laughing. I'm sorry, I can't look at that Johnson over there. I'm sorry. I caused the President of the United States to mess up in the middle of his speech. And there's a video called Presidential Bloopers, and you'll see a much younger me, but you'll see me making the president mess up. And that is what I'm known for speaking about at Washington, D.C. True story. Well, let's bow our heads before we get started here. Dear God, we thank you again so much for caring about each and every one of us. Lord, you have a plan for our life and a plan that's good. And I just ask in a special way that you will help us to realize that if we still have air in our lungs, you're not done with us yet. And so, Lord, I just ask a special blessing upon everyone in this room and those who will even watch by way of internet. May they just understand that you, once again, have such an awesome plan for their life. And I just ask now that you take self out of Terry Johnsson and help me, Lord, as always, to be a mirror to reflect to you. In your name we pray. Amen. If I had to give my little talk here a title today, I would simply call it Problems. But I'm sure no one in Australia has problems. And I'm sure at Springwood, there's no problems here. There's no financial problems. There's no spiritual problems. There's no health. I'm sure this is just a perfect place. But those of you who might have a problem like I do, well, I hope this will be helpful for you. Now, a few years ago, I had the chance to meet a gentleman who had such an influence in my life. Now, he was a retired minister. He was not an Adventist minister, but he had pastored the same church for over 53 years. He was still the senior pastor at age 90. And he still preached every week himself. And when he retired at age 90, he still spoke almost 100 times a year. Now, he wrote a book many, many, many years ago called The Power of Positive Thinking. And his name was Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. Now, it's interesting because the book was originally called Positive Faith. And as he submitted this book, no one would buy it. They would say, no one wants to hear that stuff. And so he got so discouraged that he threw it in the trash can. And luckily, his wife came and took it out of the trash can and simply said, Norman, you know, you always are talking about our attitude makes such a difference in life. That positive thinking you're always talking about, how God has a way of just working things out. Why don't you just change the name of the book? So he didn't want to do it, but he listened to her, and he changed the name, and the book went on to sell over 50 million copies, one of the top-selling books in the world. Now, when I met Dr. Peale, he was around 90-something years old. And this is a story that he shared with me. And I love the way he said it. He says, Terry, when I was a young man, around 83 years old, he said, I was walking into the church one day, and this gentleman came up to me and simply said, are you Dr. Peale? And I said, yes. Are you the one who's always talking about when we have difficulties in life, God has a way of still working things out? He says, well, I've never been introduced that way, but I guess you can say I'm that guy. He says, well, Dr. Peale, I wanted to come to you myself and just let you know one thing. I am quitting all this Christianity stuff. I'm done. I'm out of this stuff. And Dr. Peale looked at his watch and said, well, you know, I have a few moments. Let's come in my office and let's talk. So the guy follows Dr. Peale in his office, and they sit down, and Dr. Peale pulls up a chair and just simply said, well, just tell me what's wrong. He says, Dr. Peale, I'll tell you what's wrong. It's one word. And the word is simply this: problems. Everywhere I go, there's a problem. I wake up in the morning and start thinking there's problems. I talk to my wife and she has problems. Talk to my kids, they have problems. I get to work and there's even more problems. Everywhere I go, there seems to be a problem. So I'm just quitting this Christianity stuff. And Dr. Peel thought for a few moments and he said this, you know what? I was at a place the other day where no one had a problem. And the guy said, no one had a problem. He said, well, Dr. Peel, how many people were there? And Dr. Peel said, I don't know, maybe 10,000. He says, where is this place at? He says, right here in New York City. And the guy got excited. He says, there's a place in New York City. There's over 10,000 people and no one has a problem. Dr. Peel, I want to go there right now. Please take me. Please take me. And as some of you have already imagined, Dr. Peel said, all right, if you want to go to Roseland Cemetery, I'll drive you there myself. You see, what Dr. Peel was saying is that no matter how long we live in life, we're going to face challenges. That's part of life. In fact, in America, one of my heroes, her name was Harriet Tubman. She lived way back in the 1860s. She was a black American woman and a slave, actually. And when everything was over with slavery, the reporter asked her this. He says, Harriet, we don't understand this. You keep saying over and over, you love bad days. That just doesn't make sense to us. And what she said, I will never forget. She says, that's right, I like bad days. In fact, I love them. Then she went on to say, because if I didn't have a bad day, I wouldn't know what a good day was. You see, friends, it's all about our attitude. You see, when we face difficulties, we have two options. Option one, we can simply say, poor me. You know what? This always happens to me. This is just the way life is. And I have discovered that when I start thinking that way, my problem doesn't go away. It actually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Our option two, you can simply say this, Lord, what are you trying to teach me? Lord, I can't believe you trust me enough with this situation. It's all about our attitude. If you have your Bibles with you, I'm going to invite you to turn with me to the book of Mark, and we're going to read about a person who faced a problem. That's Mark chapter 10, and we're going to read verses 46 through 52. Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. And it simply says this. Then they came to Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples together with a large crowd was leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout. He began to say, Son of David, have mercy on me. Verse 48, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called the blind man, cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped to his feet and he came to Jesus. Verse 51, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus, your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and he followed Jesus along the road. Here we have a gentleman that's facing a problem. In fact, I did a little bit of research of the average person who was blind in those days, and this is what his life most likely would have been like, is that he would have woke up in the morning and got ready, and then he would have to beg someone to take him to the city gates. Now just think about that for a moment. You're begging someone to take you to go beg. Then the typical person would beg for around 16 hours. And then you would have to beg someone to take you back home again. So you're begging someone to take you to go beg, you're begging all day long, and then you're begging someone to take you back home again. Day after day after day after day. Now, the scripture says something that I think is so remarkable. In fact, it's so remarkable, I like to say that I don't think Bartimaeus was blind. Now, some of you may say, Pastor, what do you mean? It says right there he was blind. What are you talking about? But let me say this. Bartimaeus used a phrase, son of David. And that was a phrase or a title that was only used for the true Messiah. So, in other words, Bartimaeus may have been physically blind, but he was not spiritually blind. There were many people there who had sight, but they could not see and recognize who Jesus was. But you had blind Bartimaeus, in the middle of all of his problems, was able to recognize Jesus, the Son of God. What an example for us. It lets us know no matter where we are in life, no matter what difficulty you might be facing, you can always have eyesight to see Jesus. Always. And what is so unique is that when Bartimaeus cried out to Jesus for help, notice what the people did. Instead of encouraging him, they simply told him to be quiet. Don't disturb Jesus. You know what? Your problem isn't that bad. Just don't. And that could have been the end of the Bartimaeus story right there. But Bartimaeus refused to listen what people were saying about him. In fact, the scripture says that he cried even more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And then the miracle happens. Jesus stopped. And do you know that that same Jesus that stopped for Bartimaeus in the midst of all the difficulty will stop for us? What are you going through today? What are you facing that seems impossible? What is making you want to give up? Friends, I'm here to say, God's not done with you yet. If you're still here, you still have air in your lungs, He still has a plan for your life. Don't let your problems defeat you. Instead, allow that problem to turn into a miracle. Now, if I can just take you back in time just a little bit. Now, I want y'all to just imagine this for me. A little grade 2, a little primary, grade 2 little fella. Now, he's a little cute fella. Now, well, he's a little bit bigger than the rest of the kids, but let me tell you about this little fella. He's energetic. He loves to talk. He loves people. Now, he attended a very large school, and in fact, well, what had happened is that they wanted to save money in the school area, and so they closed down a lot of little tiny primary schools, and they created what they call a mega elementary school. All it meant was this, that the teacher went from teaching 19 kids by herself to 57 kids. Can you imagine that? One teacher, 57 little grade 2 kids. And they would tell her, well, if you complain, you know what? We laid off many teachers. They would love to take your place. So this poor teacher had to do the best that she could possibly do. So she decided that she would divide the class into 3 sections. The very first couple rows were kids who could just learn just like that. She could just tell them the assignment and they could pick it up. Then the next couple of rows were for kids she had to work with a little bit, but they could eventually catch up. And then the third row were for kids who were in their own world. Well, this little fella started off on the front row. Once again, he was energetic. He loved people. He loved to talk. Well, one day the teacher was writing something on the chalkboard. She turned around and simply said this, I need someone to come up here and to write their ABCs. And this little fellow in the front row started thinking in his mind, don't pick me, don't pick me. And you know exactly what happens when you start thinking that. You come up here. So the little fella comes up, she gives him the chalk, and he's just shaking. He writes his A, and when he wrote his B, all the kids started laughing. And when he wrote his C, he wrote it backwards. They started laughing even more. And then all of a sudden the teacher realized that this little fella had been faking it. He could neither read nor write. Every time there was a writing assignment, he would have to go to the bathroom, or he would say he left his books at home. There was always an excuse. It made sense to her. So she took the little fella and she put him in the second section. Well, that didn't work. She ended up putting him in the third section. That didn't work. And finally, after a month, she would have the little fella sit in the back of the room with a coloring book. And he would sit there and color while the rest of the kids did their arithmetic and all the stuff and math, all that stuff. And he would be back in the back just coloring away. He thought, wow, I love school. This is great. All I have to do is color. School is fantastic. And he would just be coloring away just as happy as he can be. Well, one day something happened that forever changed his life. You see, a teacher walked in from another class and she was going to ask that teacher a question, not realizing that the little fellow was listening to the conversation. And she simply said this: "Why is that little fellow in the back with a coloring book?" And the words that teacher said, that little fellow would never forget it for the rest of his life. She simply said this: "He's just a little, mentally retarded. And so, he's never going to be able to learn. So we're just going to put him back there. In fact, I'm just buying the coloring books myself because I don't want to have to fill out all that paperwork to get him out of this class. And I'll just get him out of here at the end of the year." And when the little fellow heard those words, "can't learn," retarded, he wouldn't even color anymore. In fact, she would give him a coloring book and he would rip it and throw it at her. She would bring crayons, he would break the crayons and throw them. And so finally, this poor teacher didn't know what to do, and so she had the little fellow go see a psychologist, a counselor. And so the little fellow met with the counselor and psychologist, and finally the psychologist, after a couple of weeks, said, "You're a smart kid. In fact, you're probably one of the smartest kids I've seen. Just say your ABCs. You and the teacher probably just don't get along, and just say your ABCs and I'll get you a new teacher and get you out of here." And the little fella said A, B, C, and then he froze. Well, that psychologist wrote a letter to the superintendent, who in our area is in charge of all of the entire school district. And that little fellow's mother got a letter. And the letter basically said this: "Terry Johnsson is mentally incompetent. He will never be able to learn past grade 3. Our suggestion is to take him out of the school system, and hopefully by the age of 18, he will learn a steel art trade and be able to fit back into society. Because of his temper, visiting rights every 4 months from his parents. Signed, the superintendent." Friends, we're talking about problems. So I want you to understand this now. You have the teacher saying that this little fellow couldn't learn. You have a psychologist saying that this little fellow, I've tested him, there's no way he's going to learn past grade 3. And then to make matters worse, you have the superintendent who's appointed by the governor, the highest person in the state, saying that we have reviewed everything. The little fellow can't learn. And like Bartimaeus, that should have been the end of my story. But let me tell you one thing, what made the difference. Little Terry had a secret weapon. And let me tell you what that secret weapon was. A praying mother. A mother that believed that nothing's impossible with God. In fact, friends, I will never forget that summer break as long as I live. Every evening, my mom would pray over me. She would place her hand on my chest and say, "God has a plan for your life." She would quote Jeremiah 29:11 over and over. In fact, Mom put her prayers to action. She took out a piece of paper and she got out what we call the phone book, and she wrote down every primary school she could find in that book. And Mother called every school up to see if they would let me back into the school system. 110 different schools she called. Every single one of them said no. because my mom was so honest. They would say, well, why can't he go back to his old school? And mom would say, well, they say he can't learn. Well, who said that? The superintendent appointed by the governor? That's my boss's boss's boss. And they would hang up the phone on her. But mom never gave up. Well, finally, towards the end of the summer, where everyone had said that the little fella can't learn, it's over with, a neighbor was speaking with my mom, and the neighbor said, well, have you tried Columbia Christian, the little tiny school down the street? And my mom said, I didn't know they were still there. She says, yes. So mom goes and she meets with the principal. And the principal hears the whole story. And he simply says, you know what, ma'am, we're a little small school. There's no way that we could have one teacher work with that. We only have 30 kids in the whole school. There's no way we can have one teacher work with a kid that needs that help. But he said, at least let me pray with you. And my mom was so thankful that this guy at least took time to pray with her. In fact, when I wrote my very first book, I had the chance to interview that principal. And he says, Terry, I did something with your mom after 37 years of being a principal I had never did in my life. And that is that normally when it's a private conversation, I shut the door. But it always haunted me that I left that door open when I was talking to your mom. Now, if I felt uncomfortable, I'll call my secretary in, but I left the door open. And let me tell you the miracle of miracles. There was a teacher who was coming to ask the principal a question. So she saw the door open. She didn't think it was that big a deal, so she walked in while they were praying. And so when they were done praying, my mom walks out. The teacher walks over to the principal and simply says this, what grade would that little fella be in? And the principal said, who are you talking about? The little fellow who his mom just walked out. He says, I don't know. If he didn't learn anything in grade 2, I guess he has to take that all over again. She says, that's my class this year. He says, yes. She says, let me have that little fella. He says, Mrs. Sherlock, your class is already full. I don't know. I got a good feeling about that little fella. He says, you don't even know him. I don't know. I got a good feeling about him. In fact, I'll make a deal with you. Let me have him for 6 months. And if he can't learn to read in 6 months, we can take him out. At least we can say we tried. And so, friends, I will never forget the very first day of class. I'm there in that little tiny classroom. All of a sudden, you could hear a squeak, squeak, squeak. The teacher turns around and says, who's making that noise in my classroom? And it was me. I had my desk, and I was pulling it to the corner. Because in my mind, I always sat in a corner by myself. So she runs over to me and says, what do you think you're doing? I said, I'm sitting in the back. I always sit back here. She says, well, not in my class. She picked up my desk, brought it to the front row and sat it down and said, you're going to sit right here. I thought, whoa, I like this lady. She says, we're going to work on your reading. So she gave the rest of the kids their assignment. She came back with her chair and a Bible and sat down next to me and says, all right, we're going to work on your reading. Now, what I'm asking you to do is tell me, what does a letter look like? You don't have to read the word. Just what does a letter look like? And I looked at her and said, I can't read. She says, what did you just say? I said, I can't read. She says, do you believe in God? I said, yes. Do you believe that with God, all things are possible? I said, yes. Well, I better never hear another negative word out of your mouth without you trying. All I'm asking you is to try. What does a letter look like? And once again, I said, I can't read. She says, wait right here. I have the cure. And I'm thinking, I really like this lady. She's going to probably come back with some glasses or maybe a magnifying glass. I love this lady. Well, she came back okay. And I don't know if they do this here in Australia. She came back with a 12-inch ruler. She said, if you make one more negative word out of your mouth without trying, you're going to get it. Now, what does the letter look like? And I'm thinking, surely she's not going to hit me. I looked at her and I said, I can't reach. She took that ruler and went, pow, right on my hand. And from that moment on, I thought she was the meanest lady in the world. I hated her. In fact, I will never forget Mrs. Sherlock as long as I live. She was 5 foot tall and 5 foot wide. Bless her heart. Never forget her. And Mrs. Sherlock, I'm telling you, every recess, the kids could go out and they could play. And she would pull up her chair, take out her ruler and her Bible. We're going to work on your reading for the first 15 minutes. After school, all the kids could play on the playground while the buses lined up. She would have me in that classroom with her ruler and her Bible, day after day after day. Well, friends, in the end of 6 months, guess who was reading for the first time in his life? Terry Johnsson was reading. Friends, we're talking about miracles here. We're talking about nothing's impossible with God. Even when problems seem difficult, God has a way of working it out. When I was selected to the President's Honor Guard at the White House, I will never forget, anyone who works within 5 feet of the President of the United States, or you're going to be near the Queen of England and all these dignitaries, you have to take a 3-day examination. It's called a Presidential Psychological Examination. And it's just a fancy test to see if you're crazy or not. That's what it boils down to. And so you'll have everyone from CIA agents, Secret Service, all of us are there taking this 3 days of testing. And I will never forget, at the end of the 3 days, they said everyone had passed. And so everyone's clapping. And then the instructor simply said this: I would like to see an Airman Terry Johnsson after class. I'm thinking, what did I do? And one of the Secret Service agents walked by me. He said, man, you must have cheated. They're going to arrest you. So I'm thinking I'm about to get arrested. I'm horrified. So I decided that I would wait till everyone left the room. And that way, if they arrest me, no one would be there. And so I'm kind of acting like I'm getting stuff out of my desk, waiting for the last person to leave. And finally, the last person leaves. I go over to the instructor. And as soon as I got close to her, she simply looked at me and said, I want to shake your hand. I said, shake my hand? Okay. She says, we can't believe this. The reporters are going to be here soon. CNN News, BBC News, all these people are going to be here in a few moments. This is so exciting. I said, news people? She says, we're taking bets on you downstairs. Taking bets on me? She says, don't you know? I said, no. What? You're going to be the first handicapped person to work for Ronald Reagan. Handicapped? She says, you have one of the worst cases of dyslexia we have ever seen in our life. Your letters were, but the craziest thing is this, you're reading at a college level. That doesn't make sense. So we're trying to figure out what do they use? So she started saying all these fancy theories, and did they use that in these I said, ma'am, I've never heard any of that stuff. She says, well, how'd you learn to read? And when I said Bible and ruler, you should have seen the look on that lady's face. And she says, you know we're going to do a background check on you. I said, man, I'm telling you the truth. She says, no, you know. In fact, when they did my background check, it was $87,000 that it cost. They checked everything you can imagine. In fact, they went to our Adventist Academy College. They went up to the principal, and they can never tell why they're there. They can only say, by order of the President of the United States, we need to see every record you have on Terry Johnsson. And they said that as soon as they said that to my principal, he said, I knew this was going to happen one day. I knew he was going to get arrested. I knew. So I was excited when years later, a few months later, after I made the honor guard, I was could tell them why I was really there. But friends, it was an absolute miracle. How God took a situation that should have been impossible. And that's why I say, what are you going through? What are you facing that seems difficult? I want you to know that there's nothing impossible for God. That I know that as believers, it's easy for us to come to church and we can all put smiles on our face. Some of us can even say happy Sabbath and all the right things. But inside we're going through stuff. And friends, that's why I want you to know that I don't believe I'm here by accident today. That the Lord wanted you to know that he still has a plan for your life. That he's not done with you. I don't care if you're 90 years old or if you're 9 years old. Once again, if you still have air in your lungs, he still has something for you to do on this earth. And so maybe it does seem impossible. Maybe there are some here that have a loved one they've been praying for such a long time. And it seems like the more you pray for that loved one, the worse that they get. Nothing's impossible with God. Maybe you're facing a health concern and you've gone to the doctors, you've done everything, and it just doesn't seem to be making sense. There is nothing impossible with God. Maybe spiritually, you know you're just not connected the way that you should be. You're not getting the full power that God has for your life. Nothing is impossible with God. And that brings us back to our story in conclusion. It says that Jesus stopped and he said, bring him here. Bartimaeus was, thank goodness that he did not listen to the people who told him to give up. I'm glad my mother didn't listen to the people who told her to give up, that little fella would never be able to learn. And notice what it says here. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped to his feet. Now I want y'all to understand this now. The cloak would have been one of the most valuable things that Bartimaeus had. The cloak was what he would sleep on. The cloak would be when he would go and beg, he would lay that out and that would claim his territory. But Bartimaeus was willing to put that aside to go to Jesus. What cloak is holding you back from what God has in store for you? Maybe it's negative thinking. You just keep thinking, you know what, this has always happened. It's not going to get any better. This is just the way it is. This always happens to me. And friend, I'm here to tell you that cloak, if you don't put that aside, you're not going to get the full blessing that God has in store for you. Maybe the cloak is giving up too early. As soon as you face a little bit of difficulty, you just quit. Oh, you know what? It's not going. Put that aside and go to Jesus. You see, Bartimaeus didn't want anything in between his blessing and Jesus. And I believe in my heart that God will reveal to you what that cloak is that's holding you back in order to have his full blessing. In conclusion, a few years ago I was asked to speak at a penitentiary system there in the state of Oregon. And we had a chaplain who was a Seventh-day Adventist who was in charge of the whole system. And when I would come home from college to visit, he would come to me and say, Johnson, there are so many guys who could hear, guys, if they heard your story, that are prisoners, you could make such a difference in their life. Would you be willing to go and to speak? I said, sure, no problem. And I would be there for 2 weeks on vacation, never hear from him again. I would come back home and he would run into me at church and he would say, Johnson, I would love for you to speak to these. And this went on for almost 2 years. And finally, he says, you know what? It's happened. It's going to happen. And when he took me to the Oregon penitentiary system, I understood why it took so long. He had did something that they had never did in the history of the state of Oregon. You see, what he decided to do was to bring as many prisoners together in one spot to let them hear my story. And so when I agreed to speak, they had said, well, now you have to sign this form. And I signed a form that says that I would not sue Oregon if something happened to me. That in fact, they would drag me through the courtyard. There'll be a car there waiting for me. They'll get me through the gates the best that they can. And if you're willing to speak, still, we'll let you speak. And so I signed the form. And they said, don't get off the stage. There's going to be a stage thing there. And we're going to have guards all below. Because they were bringing different gang members in. They were bringing in neo-Nazis and all these people together. Never happened before. So I'm there and I'm sharing my story. And there's a gentleman who they brought in after everyone was sitting facing this direction. And what was unique is that this gentleman had handcuffs on. He had a chain that went to sucking around his waist, then another chain that went to shackles on his ankle. He had 4 guards around him with nightsticks out They walked him to a chair. They sat this guy in a chair, and the entire time I'm speaking, those guards stood right by him. Now, at the very end of my talk, I decided to have a special prayer. And I told these prisoners that there are many of you here. You've had someone who was praying for you. You have a mom, you have a grandma, or maybe a neighbor, someone who was praying for you. And God's not done with you. And friends, when I made that, I invited people to stand. The first guy who stood up and started crying like a baby was a bald neo-Nazi skinhead. He's crying, tears coming down his face. He's saying, that's my story. I can relate to what he's saying. That's my story. Then another guy. And finally, the whole place, these guys are standing up. They're crying like babies. The guards are shocked. They can't believe this. And then I noticed the guy in the very back with all the shackles and chains, he stands up. But as soon as he stood up, the guards with their nightsticks, they pushed him back down again. He stood up, they pushed him back down, and finally they were almost fighting. They were trying to hold the guy down, and I'm thinking, if he's trying to stand for Jesus, what harm is that? And so even though they told me not to get off the stage, I jumped off the stage. And the guards tried to reach me. By that time, I'm walking towards the back, and prisoners are coming, they're trying to hug me, and I'm just going towards the back. And I get back there, and they're almost fighting with this guy, and I simply said, stop. If he wants to make a stand for God, what harm is that? And the guards backed up. And then this guy walks over and gets within inches of my face, and he simply says this: you don't remember me, do you? Now, trust me, if I knew someone so bad that they had to have handcuffs, shackles, 4 guards, I think I would remember him just a little bit. I said, I don't know you. He said, it's me, Tim. Who sat next to you in the 3rd row before they put you in the corner with the coloring books? It was one of my classmates from the 2nd grade. Over 30-something years, that was the first person that I had seen from that class. He says, Terry, you just better thank God that your mother did not put you in that place where they were going to send you. It was horrible. The very next year, they put me in there. They wouldn't even let us eat with our hand, with our silverware. We had to eat with our hands. It was so bad. And eventually, they had to close the place down. It was so bad. But he said, Terry, they would only let us visit our parents every 4 months. And I would tell the people there, I know I have a hard time reading, but I love math. I can do math like that, but no one would believe me. He says, by the time I was 15, I was arrested 17 times. They would bring me back there. I would run away again. And finally, when I turned 17, they stopped looking for me, and I started selling drugs in the street. He says, I want you to go home and do an internet search and just type in the word, the human calculator. He says, you're going to see that was my street name. They called me the human calculator because even though I couldn't read good, I could do math. Every drug transaction I did in my head, never used paper. I became one of the largest drug sellers from San Francisco all the way up to Seattle, Washington. Every bit of marijuana went through me. He says, read it. When they arrested me, I was making $100,000 a week. Read the article. Because people knew that if I was ever arrested, there would never be a paper trail. So they eventually got me for not paying taxes, and then they tied some murders onto me. So I'm here for the rest of my life now. I'll never get out of here. But he said, Terry, I don't understand. What made the difference between you and me? Terry, you're a worse reader than I am. Here you have all these degrees and stuff. It's not making sense. And friends, for the first time in my life, I realized something. What had made the difference was the power of prayer. There are many of you in this room here today. You're only here where you are is because someone prayed for you. That person could be resting in Jesus right now, but did you know that God is still honoring those prayers of that grandmother who prayed for that granddaughter many years ago? may they know Jesus. There are many grandfathers who prayed that we're living off of those prayers. I don't care if you're 90 years old. Never think that you got to where you were because of you. Do you know there are people who are so smarter than us, can do our work and everything blindfolded? But God is honoring those prayers that went up for us many years ago. And that's what I realized. That I was simply a product of prayer. There are many neighbors who went to our churches who maybe never had kids their own, but the Lord placed you on their heart for you to pray for them and them to pray for you. And once again, God has a purpose for you. If you're still here, he's not done with you yet. And I would like to conclude here by having a prayer for you. Maybe you have gone through something. Maybe there's someone you want to pray for. And it's just between you and the Lord. In fact, my old grandfather would say, you're either three places in life. Either you're going through something, you're coming out of something, or you're about to go into something. But you're there. Friends, God has a plan for you. If he could take a little fella like me, who they said would never be able to get out of grade 3. And I want you to hear the miracle. That he took that same little fella and placed him in the White House of the United States. I've had the privilege, I was just sharing with Sandra, I had the privilege in 1985 meeting Princess Di and Prince Charles. I was part of their hosting team. I've met the Queen of England 2 times, shook her hand. And the list goes on and on. That same little fella that they said would never be able to learn. And then I went on to miracles of miracles and received my doctorate degree. And the Lord just wanted to give me that doctorate degree to let me know, to share with people, nothing's impossible with him. And so maybe there's something that you have on your heart, and just between you and the Lord, nobody else. But I would like to pray for you. And I understand this may not be your tradition, but there are times when we go through stuff that we just have to take it to God. Like Bartimaeus, we have to say, Son of David, have mercy on my situation, Lord. And the same Jesus that stood still for Bartimaeus will stand still for you. And he said to Bartimaeus, what do you want me to do for you? And Jesus is asking you here today, what do you want me to do for you? I'm going to invite you to bow your heads at this time. And if there is something that you want to give to the Lord, I'm going to invite you to stand. And don't worry about who's next to you, who's around you. It's just between you and the Lord. God bless you. The same Jesus is stopping here today. You are not hearing me by accident here. God brought me here for a reason and for a purpose. To let you know that that situation that you're facing, I'm there. I'm going to be there for you. So once again, what do you want Jesus to do for you? God bless you. Dear God, we come before you as your children. Lord, there are many of us here today where it's easy for us to put a smile on the outside of our face, but inside, Lord, we're going through stuff. If the person just next to us knew what we were going through, they would be shocked. But Lord, you brought me here today for a reason and for a purpose. To just let someone know that it's going to be okay. That it's going to work out. That if you could take that little fella and do a miracle in his life, let my friends here know that you will do something for them. Lord, there are many of us who you start the miracle, but it doesn't work the exact way we want it to work, and so we give up. Help us, Lord, not to give up, but to just keep trusting you, even when we don't understand. For it's easy to trust you when everything is going exactly the way it should, but the true test is that we have to trust you when we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so once again, Lord, I pray for my friends that are here today. I pray for those that are suffering health concerns, those who are praying for loved ones, those who are praying for their own situation that seems impossible right now, those that want to give up, dear God. Please draw close to them. And all of us in this room, when we leave here today, may we leave here a little closer to you than when we came in. In your name we pray. Amen. Before you sit, let me just ask you this one thing. I love to do this. I want you to think about this. If you believe that God is bigger than your problem, let me say that now. If you believe that our God is bigger than your problem, let's give the Lord a hand clap. God bless you.